By the time I turned 16, she'd already trained me in ways I didn't understand. She made me memorize random strings of numbers like 43.917 to 17.687. She'd test me with patterns, ask me to identify when people's eyes shifted left before they lied. She'd make me write down every sound I heard in a room without looking up. Once I asked her why we did this. She said, because the world doesn't speak the truth, it signals it. I didn't know then that she was training me for a war that hadn't ended for her. Then came the day of her funeral. It was a cold morning in Arlington. The kind where the air smells like metal and the sky looks like unpolished steel. I was 30 now, an intelligence analyst for the U.S. Army. Ironically, I had followed her path, even though I swore I wouldn't. The honor guard handed me her folded flag. Her name was read aloud, Captain Claire Monroe, NATO Comes Division, retired. But I knew better. She never retired. She just disappeared from the records. When the crowd dispersed, a woman in a dark coat approached me. She looked like she belonged there, but not for my mother. She handed me a small, sealed envelope. No words. Just that gesture and a nod. The envelope was heavy, not with paper, but with weight. It had a wax seal stamped with a NATO insignia, faded but unmistakable, and in the center, my name, for me. My hands trembled. No return address, no instructions. When I opened it later that night, in the silence of her empty house, I found a single item, a mission order. At first, I thought it was a mistake. The header was from 1995, the year I was 5 years old. Operation title, Promise Eco status, incomplete. Assigned officer, Capt. Claire Monroe, next of kin authorization. And pending. I froze. Those were my initials. It wasn't just an old file. It was an active transfer of command. The kind that passes from one operative to another in the event of death. On the bottom of the page, in her handwriting, faint but deliberate, she had written, "Finish what silence began." I didn't sleep that night. The words kept echoing, "Finish what silence began." I dug through her old things, her medals, her journals, her ID cards. Everything was too clean, too arranged. No trace of life between the lines. But behind the last drawer in her desk, I found something taped to the back panel, a small photograph, faded at the edges. It was my mother, 20 years younger, wearing a NATO field uniform. Standing beside her was a small girl, maybe 5 or 6, brown hair, dark eyes. The girl's face was turned toward the camera, half smiling. On the back of the photo, in typewriter ink, were the words, Operation Promise Eco, Asset, V. My throat went dry. Asset? What kind of asset was a little girl? And why was that girl wearing the same pendant necklace my mother gave me on my 13th birthday? For the first time in years, I spoke to her empty chair. Who were you really, Mom? No answer, of course. Just the hum of the fridge and the ticking of the clock she never replaced, still 2 minutes slow, the way she liked it. The next morning, I did what she always taught me to do when faced with chaos. I started decoding. Every letter, every symbol, every hidden number in the document. The file ID matched a NATO communications code used for extraction ops in the Balkan region, Bosnia. 1995. That was the height of the war. I traced the coordinates listed under target evacuation zone. They pointed to a remote area near the border of Bosnia and Croatia. I felt my pulse race. My mother had never been stationed there, officially. Yet the record said otherwise. That meant one of two things. Either her entire service record was falsified, or she had been on a mission no one was ever meant to know about. That night, I dreamt of her again. She was standing in front of that same window from my childhood, whispering words I still couldn't make out. But this time, when she turned toward me, her lips moved clearly. Listen, not speak. I woke up gasping. And in that moment, I understood something I never had before. Her silence wasn't a prison. It was a code. She hadn't been keeping secrets from me. She'd been keeping secrets from me. And somehow, that mission, Promise Echo, had just found its next operative. Me. There are two versions of every soldier. The one the world salutes, and the one only their child knows. After my mother's death, I started to realize that the woman I buried under a flag wasn't the one I grew up with. The medals in her display case told a story of discipline, honor, and duty, but the woman who raised me taught me how to hide, how to observe, how to disappear without being missed. Asterisk, that wasn't patriotism. That was survival. I spent days going through her personal storage at the Army Archives in Virginia. Her belongings had been sealed under a restricted family access order, which was unusual for a retired communications officer. Even the archivist raised an eyebrow when he saw the clearance level. "Ma'am, this file's got encryption protocols we haven't used since the Cold War," he muttered. "Your mother must have been important." He paused before adding softly, "or dangerous." Inside the steel container were her personal effects, a NATO badge, a handwritten journal, a small box of ammunition, and a tape recorder, old, the kind you'd see in 1980s spy films. I played it right there in the room, half expecting static, but then came her voice, calm, cold, controlled. "If you're hearing this, I'm gone. And if you're my daughter, you already know the silence wasn't weakness. It was protection." My breath caught. "I took an oath," she continued, "not to speak of what happened in Vorovska village. Promise Echo wasn't about extraction. It was containment. We weren't saving lives, we were erasing them." The tape clicked. Then nothing. Just her recorded breathing. I sat, frozen. Vorovska, that name had been scrubbed from every map after the Balkan conflict, the kind of erased village that only exists in rumors among field operatives. What was she doing there? And why would she use the word containment? I spent the next few nights at her house, combing through her journals, thin, minimal, and coded. She never wrote full sentences, just fragments. Asset moved.
Echo compromised, child recovered, name redacted.
And on one torn page, written in faint pencil, V survived. Keep her hidden.
The oath stands.
V. The same initial from that photograph. That's when the realization started to form. The mission wasn't finished because someone was still alive. And somehow, my mother had spent her life protecting that secret. I didn't know where to begin. So I turned to the only person who might have answers, Major Samuel Reeves. My mother's old commanding officer, retired now. Living quietly in North Carolina. He was the kind of man who had seen too much and talked too little. The kind she'd call a vault in a uniform. When I arrived at his porch, he looked like he'd already been expecting me. "You look just like her," he said. "Same eyes. Same way you stand when you're about to ask a dangerous question." I didn't waste time. "What was Promise Echo, Major?" He sighed, his hand tightening on his cane. "You sure you want the truth, kid? Some promises keep you alive because they keep you blind." "Then she died blind," I shot back. "I won't." That got him. He motioned me inside. His house was filled with military relics, medals, maps, photographs. But when I mentioned Vorovska, his expression changed. "That wasn't a rescue op," he finally said. "It was a cleanup? Cleanup?" Intel said a rogue Serbian unit was running biological experiments on civilians, kids mostly. Your mother's team was sent to retrieve the research data before it could go public. But when they arrived, he hesitated, eyes distant. It wasn't an enemy lab. It was ours. I felt my stomach twist. Ours? You mean American? He nodded slowly. A joint NATO experiment. Classified beyond top secret. Human trials disguised as humanitarian testing. The kids weren't subjects, they were assets. Your mother was ordered to extract one, the only survivor. "V," I whispered. He looked up. "You found her name." The room felt smaller suddenly, the air heavier. Major Reeves leaned closer, his voice almost breaking. "Your mother took the oath that night, not to speak of what she saw, not to reveal what we did. They offered her early retirement, a new identity. But she refused the wipe. She said she'd carry it instead." He paused, staring at me. "You want to know what happened to the girl, don't you?" I nodded. He reached for an old box from under the coffee table and pulled out a yellowed folder. On its cover, Project Echo Containment. Inside were black and white photos, coordinates, and a list of operative IDs, but one photo made my breath catch. It was my mother again, holding a small child wrapped in a blanket. The caption read, "Extraction successful, asset secured."
Handler, C. Monroe.
And below it, handwritten ink, "Asset relocated under civilian identity." Name, A. Monroe. I stared at it for a long time, unable to breathe. "That's not possible," I whispered. "That's me." The major said nothing. The walls seemed to close in. The floor beneath me shifted. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my name, my past, my mother, was a carefully constructed narrative, a cover. I stumbled outside, gasping for air. My hands were shaking so violently I dropped the folder in the dirt. Papers scattered like fallen leaves, faces of children, field maps, and classified stamps. The truth was written in plain sight. But it didn't feel real. I wasn't just her daughter. I was the mission. That night, I sat on my mother's porch in the cold. I didn't cry. I just listened to the wind move through the trees. It sounded like whispers, like the ghost she carried with her all those years. For the first time, I understood her silence. It wasn't grief. It was guilt. She wasn't protecting me from her past. She was protecting the world from me. And that realization burned through my chest like fire. Somewhere in the Balkans, buried in the ashes of a forgotten war, lay the rest of the truth she died trying to contain. And now that the oath was broken, there was no one left to keep it but me. I didn't sleep for 3 nights after that visit. Every word the major said kept replaying. I wasn't just her daughter. I was the mission. The sentence lived in my head like a ticking bomb. Each second a reminder that my entire life had been scripted before I could even read. But one thing gnawed at me harder than fear. Her last words on that tape: "Finish what silence began." What if her silence wasn't just emotional armor? What if it was literal, a code? I started reviewing every recording, every journal, every voicemail she'd ever left me. It was mechanical at first, just me, my laptop, and hours of her voice filling the house again. Sometimes she was humming softly between her notes. Sometimes counting. Sometimes whispering nonsense phrases like night sky, red dust, echo clear. Then, one night, while listening to a recording from the week before she died, I noticed something strange. Every time she said the word promise, she paused exactly 2 seconds before and 3 seconds after. Not once. Not twice. Every single time. 5 seconds total. It wasn't random. It was structured. So I isolated the gaps, measured them, and converted the pauses into Morse code intervals. Dash. One word. Varoska, the same erased village the major had mentioned. My hands went cold. She hadn't just left a mission behind. She'd left directions. I cross-referenced the coordinates she made me memorize as a child. 43.917, 17.687, and aligned them with the NATO field grid from the Balkan conflict era. The numbers pointed to a restricted area, near an abandoned medical outpost, deep in Bosnia. That's when I knew this wasn't over. Her silence had been her last briefing. I reached out to one of my old colleagues at the Defense Intelligence Agency, Mike Darden. We'd served together briefly during a field rotation in Germany. He owed me a favor. When I told him what I'd found, his voice dropped. "You're digging into something that was supposed to stay dead, Monroe." "I'm already in it," I said. "I just need flight clearance and a transport." There was a long pause. "You're chasing ghosts, you know that?" "Yeah," I said quietly. "But one of them raced me." 2 days later, I was in Sarajevo, traveling under a civilian research visa. The landscape was gray and haunting, villages frozen in time, scars of war still visible on the walls. But as the road narrowed and the GPS lost signal, a strange calm settled in. For the first time since her funeral, I felt close to her, like she was guiding me through the silence again. The coordinates led me to the edge of a forest, near the Drina River. There, half buried under moss and stone, was what used to be a military communications bunker. The structure was small, no signposts, no fencing, just a concrete mouth yawning open into darkness. I hesitated at the entrance. My flashlight flickered against the rusted metal door, where faint NATO markings were still visible beneath the grime, and below them, scratched into the concrete, were words in English. Silence keeps the living safe. Her handwriting. I knew it instantly. I pushed the door open. Inside, the air smelled of damp paper and rusted circuitry. Wires hung like vines, and the walls were lined with old equipment, transmitters, data reels, sealed containers. I swept the light across the room until it hit a familiar object, a small wooden box. Same kind she kept on her nightstand when I was a kid. It had her initials, CM, burned into the lid. I opened it, expecting documents or discs. But inside was something else entirely, a pendant. My pendant. Except it wasn't. This one was identical, down to the worn metal edge. But when I twisted it gently, the top half detached, revealing a microchip inside, a memory drive. I plugged it into my field tablet. The screen blinked, and an old encryption interface appeared, classified level military. The same one I'd seen as a child when she was working late nights. I entered her birth date as the decryption key. Nothing. Then I remembered, she never used real dates. She used moments. I typed Veroska. The screen unlocked. The files were fragmented, corrupted by age, but one folder opened cleanly. It was labeled eco_log_01. Inside was a single video file. When I played it, my mother's face appeared, younger, dirt-streaked, eyes sharp with fear. She was in full tactical gear, whispering into a field camera. "This is Captain Claire Monroe. Promise Echo. Day 4. Facility breached. Containment failure confirmed. Subject V stable but exhibiting irregularities. Requesting immediate extraction." Asterisk, a voice off camera shouted something in another language, then gunfire. The feed shook violently. "If this reaches anyone," she said, turning back to the lens, "the girl is not to be used. She's the key. And if I don't make it," static swallowed her words. Then the screen went black. I stared at the frozen frame of her face for a long time. She looked terrified. Not of the mission, of what she had saved. When I left the bunker, dawn was breaking through the trees. I sat on the steps, the cold concrete pressing against my back, and tried to process what I'd just seen. All my life I thought my mother's silence was her way of running from trauma. But now I knew it was her only defense, the only way to keep something. Or someone hidden. And if I was that someone, if I was Subject V, then I wasn't just born from her mission. I was her mission. The thought chilled me to the core. I looked down at the pendant, the two halves of it lying in my hand, one from her, one from the box. Identical. Like two sides of the same secret. Maybe she'd always meant for me to find it. Maybe that was her way of breaking the oath without breaking her word. As the sun rose over the abandoned forest, I could almost hear her voice again, not in words, but in that familiar rhythm of silence. 3 seconds between breaths. 2 before she spoke. 5 beats, just enough to spell one last message. I tapped it out softly against the pendant. The silence wasn't empty. It was alive. And it was calling me back to where it all began. The road to Veroska wasn't on any GPS, even local. Drivers in Sarajevo pretended not to know it. When I showed the coordinates, one older man crossed himself and muttered, "No one goes there. Not since the war." So I drove alone. The deeper I went, the quieter the world became. Villages turned to ruins, road signs vanished, and the air grew heavy with the kind of silence that makes your heartbeat sound like thunder. It felt like driving into a memory, one that didn't want to be remembered. The last stretch was just dirt and gravel winding through skeletal trees. When I reached the coordinates, the forest opened into a clearing, and there it was, Veroska village, what was left of it. Anyway, collapsed stone houses, rusted rooftops, shattered wells. Grass had swallowed everything, like the earth itself wanted to erase the evidence. But in the center of the ruins stood a single structure, a concrete building with faded NATO markings and a cracked blue door, the same symbol I'd seen on my mother's file. Promise Echo. I parked the jeep and stepped out, boots crunching on old glass. The wind carried fragments of sound, broken shutters. Creaking wood, but beneath it all, there was another noise. Whispering. At first, I thought it was just wind funneling through the hollow buildings, but then it grew clearer. Faint, layered voices, not speaking words but patterns. Short bursts, pauses, repeats. My brain recognized it before my heart did. Morse code. I froze. Listening carefully. Dash 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 dot dash dash dot dot dash dot dot dot. Pause. Repeat. It spelled a word. Listen. I followed the sound toward the blue door. My flashlight beam cut through the dark interior, peeling paint, overturned tables, old medical crates. On one wall, barely visible beneath dust and mildew, someone had painted a phrase in English, "Eco lives here." My chest tightened. The floor was covered in dirt, scattered documents, broken vials. The air still smelled faintly of antiseptic and metal. I swept the light across the wall and saw something glint. A small, embedded plaque. It read, Project ECO, Containment Facility, NATO Humanitarian Research Division. 1995. But someone had scratched through research and carved another word over it. With a knife, experiment. I swallowed hard. In the corner of the room. An old recorder was half buried under debris. I picked it up, rewound the tape and pressed play. Static, then a child's voice. Weak, trembling. She said I have to stay quiet. She said if I speak, they'll hear me. She said the silence keeps me safe. I froze. A child. A little girl. Could that be me? The tape crackled again, the same voice, whispering now. They said my blood is different. That I can hear things others can't, but I just hear the echoes. Then, faintly, my mother's voice in the background. Don't speak, sweetheart. Promise me. The tape clicked off. My hands were shaking. It was one thing to hear stories about what happened in the war. It was another to hear your own mother instructing you not to speak, as if your voice itself could cause harm. I turned toward the back of the facility and noticed a sealed metal door. Half buried, rusted, but intact. It had a NATO biometric lock, long dead but still humming faintly with residual power. I crouched down. Pried open the control panel and saw a small fingerprint reader. Just for the hell of it. I pressed my thumb against it. The light blinked green. My breath caught. The lock disengaged. The door groaned open, releasing a gust of cold, chemical air. I lifted my flashlight and froze. Inside was a small chamber, perfectly preserved. Metal bed. Old restraints. Medical monitors lined with tape, still displaying ghostly flickers. And on the wall, written in black marker, if she finds this, tell her the silence was love. I stepped closer, tears stinging my eyes. My flashlight landed on something under the bed, a small metal box wrapped in faded fabric. I pulled it out and opened it. Inside were vials. Blood samples. Labeled Subject V. The date, April 23, 1995. The same day as my birth certificate. I staggered backward, gripping the box like it might bite. All my life. I thought I was born in a military hospital in Germany. That's what my papers said. But if the samples matched the date and if V stood for me, then my birth wasn't medical. It was experimental. And my mother wasn't my rescuer. She was my handler. The whispers returned, louder now, almost human. The same rhythm. The same word. Listen. I followed the sound into a corridor leading out of the chamber. My light flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw her, my mother, standing at the far end of the hall, her face half lit by the beam. Not real, maybe, but real enough to stop my heart. She didn't speak. Just lifted her hand and pointed toward the exit. I ran. Out of the bunker, into the cold air, my lungs burning. When I reached the jeep, the whispering stopped. The world fell completely silent again. Even the wind, that's when I saw it, etched into the side mirror with a knife. Varoska survived. The words shimmered faintly under the rising sun. I sat in the driver's seat, staring at them. If the village survived, it meant the experiment did too. Somewhere out there, the legacy of Project ECHO wasn't dead. It was alive and maybe still active. And if my mother's oath had been about keeping that truth buried, then my very existence was the secret she died protecting. I touched the pendant around my neck. The one she gave me when I was 13. The metal felt warmer than it should have. That's when I realized it wasn't just sentimental. It was another device, a tracker, or worse, a transmitter. I looked up at the tree line. Somewhere in that silence, I felt eyes on me. Not ghosts, not memories. Something, or someone, was watching, and maybe they'd been waiting for me to return all along. As I turned the ignition, the radio crackled to life on its own. A distorted voice came through, mechanical. Calm female, welcome back. Asset V mission parameters, reactivation in progress. The voice paused. Then, in perfect clarity, your mother kept her promise. And the transmission ended. I didn't sleep the night I discovered the codename Operation Promise Echo. The phrase was stamped in faded ink across the top of an old mission document I found, hidden in my mother's lockbox, the one she kept sealed for decades. The same box I wasn't supposed to open until her death, except now she was gone. And her silence was no longer protecting her. At first, I thought Promise Echo was just another military designation, maybe a humanitarian effort or a declassified op long forgotten. But when I fed the term into a restricted search database through one of my contacts at Langley, something strange happened. Every hit vanished as soon as it appeared. Almost like the system was deleting itself in real time. That's when I realized whatever Promise Echo was, it was never meant to exist. The next morning I drove to Fort Carson, where my mother had served before her disappearance. The base had changed, but the walls still whispered of missions buried under layers of patriotic lies. I sat in the visitors' lounge, staring at the same emblem my mother used to salute, an eagle with outstretched wings, a symbol of duty. But the longer I stared, the more it looked like a shadow. That's when an old voice interrupted my thoughts. Claire Monroe's daughter, right? I turned to see a man in his early 60s, wearing civilian clothes but standing like he'd never taken the uniform off. His eyes carried that unmistakable soldier's burden, the weight of remembering too much. You knew her? I asked. He nodded slowly. We all did. Nobody forgot Monroe. I leaned forward. Then tell me about Operation Promise Echo. The man's expression shifted, not shock, not fear, but regret. You shouldn't know that name, he said. But I do, I replied. And I need to know what it meant.
He sighed and looked away, lowering his voice. Promise Echo was never a sanctioned mission.
It started after a village raid went wrong. Civilians. Children. Wrong intel. Your mother led a recovery effort, not to fight but to save what was left. She broke protocol to get them out. I felt my chest tighten. That doesn't sound like something to hide.
He met my gaze. She wasn't supposed to be there.
She went against orders. Command covered it up, said the mission didn't happen. But she couldn't live with that silence. So she made a promise to the survivors to never speak a word, but to ensure someone would one day finish what she started. My pulse quickened. Someone? I whispered. Asterisk. He nodded. Double quotes you, the daughter with her name in the encrypted registry.
The Echo?
That night, I sat in my car outside the base, gripping the file like a lifeline. Every page painted a picture of my mother I had never known. Not a quiet, distant woman, but a soldier who defied orders for something greater. The mission notes described a small settlement, deep in the Middle East. Village 47. No coordinates. No maps. Just a set of hand-drawn landmarks. She'd written one final message in the margins. Almost like she knew I'd find it one day. If you read this, my silence has ended. Follow the echoes. The handwriting trembled slightly, not from age, but emotion. The next morning, I woke with one thought looping in my mind. Follow the echoes, using my mother's old military contacts and decrypted files. I began to trace the original evac routes from the 1990s operations. Most were wiped, some archived, and one still active, pointed to a humanitarian outpost in Jordan, run by a woman named Amina. It was the same name my mother had mentioned in her final hospital days, murmuring it like a prayer. So I booked a flight. When I arrived, the desert air hit me like an old memory, hot, dry, unrelenting. The kind of place where truth stayed buried under sand and silence. The outpost was small, canvas tents, satellite dishes, medical crates. and in the center stood a woman in her 40s, wearing a scarf patterned with faded stars. When she saw me, her expression softened, like she already knew who I was. "You're Claire's daughter," she said quietly. My breath caught. "You knew her?" Amina smiled sadly. "She saved us. She saved me." I felt my knees weaken. All my life, I had thought my mother was haunted by guilt. But now, standing in front of one of the lives she'd saved, I realized her silence wasn't shame. It was protection. Amina led me to a small tent filled with boxes, food, medicine, documents, and one sealed folder marked with a faded emblem. "Promise Echo." "This was hers," Amina said, handing it to me. "She told me one day a woman who looks like her but carries her eyes would come for this." Inside the folder were photos, children from the destroyed village, now grown, each one part of a new humanitarian network. The file contained bank records, coded transfers, and instructions, my mother's blueprint for rebuilding what war had broken. But at the bottom of the file was one last entry. Signed in ink, Operation Promise Echo status, incomplete. Successor assigned, Monroe. L. My name, that night under the open desert sky. I realized the truth. My mother hadn't just left me a legacy. She'd left me a mission. Her oath of silence wasn't about hiding shame. It was about ensuring the right person would speak when the world was ready to listen, and that person was me. When I landed back in the States, the desert still clung to me, the scent of dust, the silence of unanswered promises, the echo of my mother's voice. I wasn't the same person who'd left. The daughter searching for closure had become the soldier, inheriting a mission, but before I could fulfill her promise, I had to face the people who buried it. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in a federal conference room in D.C. under cold fluorescent lights, the kind that made everything look like evidence. Across from me sat 3 men in suits, Defense Department officials, their badges heavy with authority and guilt. One of them, Colonel Harding, looked at me with weary patience. "Miss Monroe, you've made some serious allegations here. Unauthorized missions, document tampering, foreign operations involving your mother. That's a lot of ground to cover." I leaned forward, sliding the declassified folder across the table. "That's not ground," I said quietly. "That's buried truth." Harding opened the file, scanning the photos of children, the coded ledgers, and finally the line assigning successor Monroe. L. His face tightened. "Where did you get this?" I looked him straight in the eye. "From the people your silence tried to erase." For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the hum of the ceiling vent and the faint creak of moral weight pressing down on the room. Finally, Harding sighed. "Your mother. She was a good soldier, but she disobeyed orders. She crossed lines we couldn't justify at the time." "At the time?" I repeated. "You mean when it was easier to lie?" He didn't answer. Later that night, I stood outside the Pentagon, staring at the reflection of its massive walls in the dark water of the memorial pond. My mother's story wasn't just personal. It was systemic, a forgotten mission that had saved lives, silenced to protect reputations. The part of me that had once sworn never to return to service felt the old fire again, not as revenge, but as duty. If she'd kept her promise in silence, I would finish it with truth. A week later, I returned overseas, this time under my own authorization. The outpost in Jordan had become my staging ground. And Amina, my mother's old ally, greeted me like a comrade coming home. "You really came back," she said, her voice trembling with pride. "I had to," I replied. This was never just her fight. Together, we began reviving the network my mother had built in secret, reconnecting families displaced by the raid, delivering aid to those forgotten by both sides, and documenting testimonies that had never reached the record. Each night, I'd sit by the flickering camplight and read my mother's field notes. Her handwriting grew fainter near the end, but every word carried the same heartbeat. "Protect them." And in her final entry, she had written, "If silence is my burden, then truth will be my child's salvation."
Now,
I understood what she meant one evening as the sun bled into the horizon. A convoy approached our camp, American vehicles, sand-caked and slow. I stepped forward, hand near my holster, until the lead door opened and Colonel Harding stepped out, still disobeying orders. I see, I said flatly. He gave a humorless smile. You sound like her. Good, I replied. He walked closer, holding a document in his hand. The department reviewed your report. Promise Eco is officially acknowledged as an unsanctioned recovery mission. We're reinstating it, under your command. For a second, I couldn't breathe. You're giving it life again? He nodded. It's overdue. Your mother was right. My chest tightened. For years, her silence had been treated as betrayal. Now, finally, it was being recognized as sacrifice. That night, I stood in the same desert my mother once had, surrounded by her legacy, soldiers, medics, civilians, all bound by one woman's quiet courage. As the wind swept over the sand, I could almost feel her presence beside me. I whispered into the open sky, Mom, I finished what you started. Amina touched my shoulder, smiling softly. She knew you would. The next morning, we began Operation Promise Echo Phase 2. New supplies. New personnel. The same mission, to rebuild what war had broken. To keep her oath alive. And for the first time in decades, the silence surrounding her story finally broke, but the reckoning wasn't just for her. It was for all of us who'd inherited the consequences of decisions made in boardrooms, signed by people who never saw the faces of those they condemned. I realized that honoring her wasn't about rewriting history. It was about restoring humanity to it. The oath of silence that once defined her life had transformed into something louder, purer, a promise reborn through her daughter. As the sun rose over the dunes, I stood at attention, not in uniform but in purpose. The radio crackled. Commander Monroe, a voice said. Orders? I took a deep breath, staring toward the horizon. Begin transmission, I replied. The world's ready to hear the echoes. The light flickered green. For the first time in my life, I understood what my mother had truly meant by silence. It wasn't surrender. It was waiting for the right moment to be heard, and that moment was now. The air was still that morning, the kind of quiet that carries memory instead of sound. The camp was waking slowly, soldiers moving between tents, the smell of coffee drifting through the dust. But I stood apart from it all, at the edge of the outpost, staring at the rising sun. That's where my mother had stood in the old photo I found in her file, hands clasped behind her back, eyes toward the same horizon. The resemblance was haunting. She'd been younger then. I was now, and she'd already made the promise that would define her life. Now it was my turn. The mission was over, or at least the part that had been written. Operation Promise Echo had been officially reinstated, and our reports had made it into the global database. The same people who once denied its existence were now claiming its success. Typical. But this time, her name, Claire Monroe, was printed in full. No redactions. No silence. I thought that would bring me peace. It didn't. Because honoring a legacy isn't about a headline or a medal. It's about understanding why it mattered. And for me, that understanding came from the people she saved. One by one, they began to return, villagers, now adults with families of their own. They came bearing photographs. Letters, small trinkets they said my mother gave them. Years ago, a little girl she once carried through the rubble. Now, TEACHER, a medic she trained, now running a clinic in Amman. Every face was a living echo of the choice my mother made when she broke orders. Each story they shared added another piece to the woman I thought I knew, and that's when it hit me. She didn't take an oath of silence out of guilt. She took it to protect a truth too, fragile to survive in the world of politics and power. Until now. That evening, Amina brought me a weathered notebook, one I hadn't seen before. She wanted you to have this when you were ready, she said. I opened it carefully. Inside were pages filled with my mother's handwriting. Fragments of unsent letters, reflections, and small details of her mission. But one line, written in faded ink, stood out like a heartbeat. Silence isn't the absence of voice. It's the space where truth grows strong enough to speak. I read it again. Slower. And I realized that all of it, had never been about secrecy. It was about timing. She hadn't wanted me to inherit her pain. She wanted me to inherit her purpose. Weeks passed. And Promise Echo evolved beyond a mission. It became a movement, an alliance of veterans, civilians, and survivors committed to rebuilding trust where war had destroyed it. We opened new medical outposts under her name. We created an education fund for children displaced by conflict. And every year, on the anniversary of her last mission, we held a small ceremony under the open sky. It wasn't military. It wasn't political. It was human. During the first ceremony, I wore her old tags around my neck, their surface worn smooth by time. When my turn came to speak, I looked out over the crowd and felt my throat tighten. I grew up in a house where silence was sacred, I said softly. I thought it was weakness. But now I know it was her greatest strength. My mother didn't die keeping secrets. She died keeping her promise. And today we renew it. I took off the tags and placed them on the small memorial stone we'd carved for her. The engraving was simple: Claire Moinaroe, who kept her oath, and passed it on, for the first time since she'd gone. The silence around her felt peaceful. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was full. That night, long after everyone had left, I stayed behind. The desert wind whispered through the empty chairs, carrying the faint hum of remembered voices. I closed my eyes and could almost hear her, that calm, steady tone that had guided me as a child, finish what I couldn't. I smiled. I already have, Mom, but there's still more to do. The stars shimmered above, reflecting in the tears I didn't bother to hide, because the truth was, the mission wasn't over. It never would be, not as long as someone still believed in what she started. Before I left the site, I pulled out my notebook, the one I'd been writing in since the day I found her file. I turned to a blank page and wrote a single sentence at the top: the oath renewed, by Monroe L. Then I signed it. It wasn't just paperwork. It was a declaration. Her silence had ended with me, but her promise would echo far beyond both our names. As I walked back toward the outpost, the dawn was breaking again, soft, golden light spilling across the sand. It felt like she was there, somewhere in the warmth. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was chasing her shadow. I was walking beside her.